You talk about the costs. The New South Wales government has just announced they're going to spend $800 million just on poles and wires to connect renewable projects to the grid. Do you think the public are awake to all of these sunken costs? I mean, we keep being told renewables are cheap, it's free energy, but the amount of money being thrown around is just extraordinary. Do the public realise, do you think?
I don't think they do. 46% of your bill now that you get for your electricity is not for the actual electricity, it's for transmission and distribution costs.
Wow.
And there are other costs that go into your bill. There's all the green schemes, the costs of the renewable energy target certificates, all the other frequency control, because your grid has got to be tightly controlled at 50 hertz, or that's 3,000 RPM. If it varies from that, it's dangerous. The grid will black out like it does if there's no electricity or there's too much electricity in the grid. All these frequency control things, all the green schemes, all the transmission costs and distribution, which is poles and wires, will be the majority of your electricity costs. Now, we are going to subsidise these grids all over the place. The base case is 10,000 kilometres, but if we're going to the full hydrogen economy that Chris Bowen wants, it's about 28,000 kilometres of poles and wires. Now, they all cost money and they've all got to be paid for. So you'll be paying for it in your bill once they're built, because they get a fixed return.
David, what I want to ask you here then, to put this in very precise, concise terms, the left and the renewable energies people say wind and solar are the cheapest form of getting those electrons to you. What you're saying is the more you put out there, the more you put out in remote parts of the country, the more you have to ship those electrons back into the grid, the more the proportion of your electricity bill that is devoted to poles and wires, that's going to go up, and nobody's going to save any money, and in fact, it's going to be a lot more expensive.
Yes, exactly. What they quote is the standalone cost. Like in the middle of a paddock somewhere down at Goulburn, as you're driving back to Sydney, you've seen in those big wind farms. The cost of electricity at the bottom of that pole, they do the figures, and putting one pole with a wind turbine up is cheaper than a power station. But to get that electricity, which is direct current, into an alternating current electricity system and transmit it, costs heaps, because you've got to build these extra grids everywhere. And same for big solar farms, it doesn't produce AC electricity, it produces DC. So you've got all these other engineering costs that go into it, as well as the poles and wires themselves. And look, if you look at the cost of having solar farm running your electricity at night, which runs cities, or wind farms, you've got to account for that. Now, solar farms and wind farms can't operate unless there's a grid. So they are demanding all these subsidies to build billions and billions of dollars of expensive bits of engineering, so that their investment gets paid a lot of money. You know, people make money out of electricity. Yep.
I've been talking to farmers, we've been talking to farmers on this station in Victoria who say these transmission lines that are going up to connect the renewables to the grid, it's not just impacting the beauty of the countryside, the aesthetic, it's impacting the way they farm. And they are saying it has a serious threat to our food security because they cannot farm the way they have been. Now, this seems to be a fairly significant issue that seems to have been overlooked. The Nationals are supposed to represent the regional areas, they're supposed to represent these people. How can we be in this state where we are implementing policies that are going to impact our food security?
Well, exactly. We are objecting. There's plenty of farmers and community groups that don't want these unnecessary extra grids coming through their town, their farm, a blight on the landscape, and they only generate or carry electricity 30% of the time if they're coming from a wind farm, or 20% of the time if they're coming from a solar farm. That's why they've got to have all these hidden subsidies that people aren't aware are built into your electricity cost. But the VNI West one, they've reassessed the cost of it. It's about $11 billion. All the costs of these turn out to be double what they say they're going to be costing. Look at Snowy Hydro 2, it's up to $12 billion and rising. Now, if we go down this renewables only path, we're going to need about 13 snowy hydros to back up wind and solar, or you're going to need a couple of $1 trillion worth of batteries to back up wind and solar when we have an East Coast low, because they're doing backup plans for 4 hours or 7 hours. But when we have an East Coast low or a wind drought, you might be out without wind power or solar power for 4, 5, 6, 7 days in a row. So all these extra costs come when you have predominantly renewable energy. Whereas if you have power stations of any sort that are running round the clock as baseload producers, their costs go down, your electricity cost goes down, transmission costs go down. You don't need poles and wires everywhere. You don't need to rip up national park culture. It's going to be trapped in these pumped hydro schemes to make expensive electricity.
David Gillespie, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for sounding the warning to us, and I can only hope that Chris Bowen and Labour wake up to the threats of blackouts and higher power prices and food insecurity before it's too late.